Your moderator today has a tremendous amount of experience in education. Sajan George has worked with Joel Klein in New York City in the great reforms that they did there. He has worked with Michelle Reed in Washington, D.C., and what she did there. He was in New Orleans before the hurricane hit and stayed on to dramatically change their whole school system into a system of charter schools. He's working now in Detroit, Michigan. Now, kid him, he's sort of cherry-picking all the easy school systems in the country. He heads the education practice of Alvarez and Marsal. He is located here in Atlanta and is a great resource. And I'd like you to please welcome Sajan George.
Good morning. Before I briefly introduce the panel, let me sort of set the stage a little bit. There's an education documentary that you may have seen called Waiting for Superman that's getting a lot of, really creating a national conversation around what's wrong with public education and how do we fix it. And for those of you who haven't seen the documentary, there's this point in the documentary where they give this statistic, and you've probably heard this before, but American children currently rank 21st in math in the world and 25th in science. And keep in mind, about a generation ago, we were #1 in both. And then the documentary says, but we're #1 in one category. And American kids compared to their international counterparts are #1 in terms of self-confidence. And about this time in the movie, your head hits your hands and you think, we're raising a generation of overconfident idiots. And as you start to despair, you begin to think about, well, how do we fix this? And you know, the title of this panel is called The Promise of Digital Learning. And the silver lining in this dark cloud in terms of what's happening in publication is this. Digital technology has changed every aspect of our life. Amazon changes the way we buy books. Apple changes the way we buy music. Facebook changes the way we track friends. Google changes the way we obtain and search for information. It's changed every aspect of our life except one. We live in a digital world, and yet our kids continue to learn in analog environments, sitting in classrooms that look pretty much the same they did about 100 years ago, moving through a printed curriculum, no multimedia, no hyperlinks. But those companies that I just listed that are at the forefront of digital technology, they're all American companies. They were birthed and created in this. So the promise of digital learning is, to the extent that we can leverage those technologies into our classroom, we can once again lead the world, because we're leading the world and using that technology in pretty much every other sphere except public education. We've got a great panel. You've got a full bio of each of them in your booklet. So I'm going to actually briefly just introduce them so that you know who they are, faces to names, but I won't give them justice as their resumes deserve. On my far right, your left, is Susan Patrick. She is the president and CEO of the International Association of Online K-12 Learning, or INACOL as it's called. We're very privileged to have Susan here because she crisscrosses the country, really meeting with states, their governors, their superintendents, helping set policies on online learning and digital learning. And then next to her is Klaus. Chris is the CEO of Kaneva. Kaneva is basically a virtual world. He has over 2 million members, where the virtual allows them to do everything from social engagement to entertainment. And for those of you who are wondering, I can barely make it in the real world, why would I ever want to enter a virtual world? Chris will help answer that question, but more importantly, your kids are not asking that question. They're in this space. And so there's many things we can learn in terms of how business is using those technologies and what those analogies could be to help impact the classroom. But last and definitely not least, one of the dangers of doing a summit like this and talking about what's possible in education is it's very theoretical, and we needed a real practical way to explain to you what is actually happening. And so Vicki Davis, to my immediate right, is a teacher here in Georgia, Camilla, Georgia. And as her alias and blog, Cool Cat Teacher, will tell you, an award-winning blog, she's doing some really exciting things, teaching kids not only here in Georgia, but actually helping them learn how to use current technology to collaborate, to connect, and to create with students, thousands of students from around the world. She was featured in Thomas Friedman's book, the world is flat, and several of our wiki projects, like the Flat Classroom, have gotten national acclaim. So with that brief sort of overview, and I apologize for doing it quickly, but again, you have their full bios. Let me start off, and what I'd like each of the panelists, because they each have a different perspective, I'd like them to talk a little bit about what the current state of play is in digital learning. I'm going to start with Susan first, both domestically, Susan, and internationally. What's happening in this space that the audience should be aware of?
Thank you, and thanks for having the opportunity to come and be here in Georgia with all of you. I first got interested in learning about what was happening in online learning when I was at the U.S. Department of Education as the Director of Educational Technology. In 2005, I released the last National Ed Tech Plan, and the one area of all technology and education that I saw fundamentally holding the most promise for changing what students could access, how they could learn, how they could have access to the best teacher anytime, any place, were virtual schools and online learning. That whole market of opportunity is rapidly evolving. It's rapidly evolved over the last 10 years to include hybrid and blended models and ways that students can have a personalized and customized education like never before. That is here. It's happening all across the US, but the barriers that limit students' opportunities are very much grounded in policy barriers, which is why I spend so much of my time in state capitals all over the country. And so quickly in the US, what is exciting about this promise is that despite all of the hurdles, the #1 barrier in policy is funding based on seat time. Seat time does not fit the way children learn, how children learn. If you look at other countries and the way they fund per pupil, but if you look at the definition of the Carnegie Unit from the Condition of Education Report in the US Department of Ed to the way it is in code in most states, it's assuming a minimum of 40 minutes per course over 180 calendar day. When you have students, the one thing we know about education is that kids learn at different rates, at different paces, that this idea that we have a single teacher with a single textbook in a single classroom with kids lined up in rows, and they're limited in their opportunity to the resources and the kind of talent and the expertise that you are able to put in that space. When they look out the window and they see the way the rest of the world works, everybody is connected. People in blue-collar jobs, white-collar jobs, connecting, collaborating, have access to a wealth of resources. So in the US, what's exciting is that now we see the growth of K-12 online learning at 30% annually. That is huge. In states like Florida, where the funding follows the student down to the enrollment, this is true in Minnesota too. So it doesn't cost the state anymore, but the funding follows the student. Actually, Florida Virtual Schools funded, as Bob mentioned, Governor Weiss, only for successful completion. It is a public education funding model on performance down to the course level. So those courses are funded at the same per pupil rate minus 11% because they're taking out space and transportation costs. The biggest costs in online education are teachers and people to run the programs and the increased cost of the technology. So online learning is growing at 30% annually in the US. How many states have state virtual schools? Today, that number has grown from just 8 back in 2004 to 28 states. Georgia is one of them. There are big waiting lists for courses from the Georgia Virtual School because that is funded based on policy with an appropriation rather than having the funding follow the student. If you had the funding follow the student like it does in Florida or Minnesota, you could scale that. That's something very important to keep in mind. So you have 28 states with state virtual schools. You have 27 states with full-time virtual opportunities. In all 50 states, there are blended learning and online learning opportunities happening. So a quick snapshot of the US, but let's take a look at what's happening across the globe. So in the US, we have now gone from, in 2000, about 50,000 student enrollments in K-12 online learning to over 2 million online course enrollments, and that number is closer to 4 million when you look at blended and hybrid models like the types that we see starting to emerge. Overseas, I'm just going to start with the UK. How many people are familiar with the International Baccalaureate programs offered around the world? The IB started a diploma program online 3 years ago where they took their curriculum, rigorous curriculum, they moved into what we call gold standard, high quality online course development, high quality digital lessons. They trained their best teachers to teach online. They started this working across 26 different countries. Today, they're in 125 different countries with the IB diploma program online. So when I go around the country, I say to all of you in your districts, does every kid have access to a high quality IB program? Because you can make that so with online learning. If you go from England and you go, let's say, to Turkey, 3 years ago they had 0 students enrolled in online courses. Through a public-private partnership with the government, they developed high-quality online courses that are taught by high-quality teachers, high-quality faculty, trained to teach online. They went in the first year to reach how many students with online courses? 0 to 5 million. In 3 years now, they're reaching 15 million of 16 million kids. There is a big lesson here. In India, they have a goal in 10 years to provide universal access to K-12 education. How many more schools would they have to build? 200,000. 70% of those schools would be in rural areas. Guess what? They don't have the money to do that. They also have shortages of highly qualified teachers. So what are they doing? A public-private partnership where they brought in EduComp, a company to develop world-class, internationally benchmarked digital curriculum, and then what? Train their best teachers to teach online, and then make access in community centers, libraries, wherever they can get it. This model that EduComp is developing is low-cost buildings or structures where the kids can come in and access this online learning, and their goal, again, is to scale up to have universal access. The last example I'll use, South Korea has a national virtual school. This is happening all over the world. China has a goal in the next 10 years to reach how many more students with online learning? 100 million. 100 million. China has, how many kids do we have in the US total in K through 12? Yeah, 50, 55 million. China has 60 million kids that they classify as gifted. We can't afford to have a third of our kids drop out of high school and a third of our kids go into college and need remediation and then drop out and only graduate a third of our kids from college. We're in this work of a thirds with the 55 million that we start off with. We need to ensure that every single student has an education that is customized to them. So hopefully that gives you a picture of what's happening around the US. It's great that Georgia has the policy to have full-time virtual schools, although the funding level is so wildly off. So wildly off. If you're funding regular education at $8,900 a student, I'm not sure I have the exact number right, we're seeing the national average for funding full-time virtual schools at $6,500 a student. That's good news. There's a cost savings there, but you're wildly off at the number that you're at now. That needs to be addressed. And number two, you really need to address on the state virtual programs, or the programs where the money follows the student down to the enrollment, so you can achieve those cost savings and open up access.
Susan, one quick question for the audience. What country would you say we should benchmark ourselves to currently in terms of their online learning policy?
Well, it's interesting. Right now, you're going to see, they're not there yet, but we've got 30 people coming to our conference next week from Australia. They're doing a laptop for every student in grades 9 through 12. They have digitized their entire curriculum, and they're working to do so every student has access. They're fundamentally changing it. If we had to benchmark against anyone, it's hard to do this because Singapore is a small country, right? And they're very tightly controlled. Singapore has online learning and blended learning in 100% of their schools. 100% of their teachers and their teacher training programs, when they come out, know how to use online learning. And they hold e-learning week once once 1 week every year, where they physically shut schools down and ensure that learning can happen anytime, any place. So the students know how to do it, the teachers know how to do it. Why do they do this? Remember H1N1? What happened in the US? A couple people got sick, right? And we shut schools down completely for 5 days, completely losing that productivity. What did they do in Singapore and in Hong Kong and in many countries in Asia? They used their digital resources that they already had access to the devices, and they continued learning for everybody else in the school, and if they had to shut schools down, those who were healthy could continue to learn. It's a disaster recovery. What could we have done with Katrina if everybody had been using blended and hybrid and online learning? All of those teachers and all of those students that were dispersed could have continued in the process. So Singapore is definitely at the top of the list for having online learning in all of their schools and those opportunities.
Great. Vicki, kind of localize it for the audience. Tell us what's happening in the booming metropolis of Camilla, Georgia, and some of the exciting things you're doing there.
Okay. You wanna swap places?
Sure.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here, and I guess I'm the token teacher here. I'm at a very small school, Westwood Schools in Camilla. Yes, we're a private school, but everything that I'm doing, we're doing with public schools all over the world. Charter schools, everything. And when I speak at conferences, people know me as Cool Cat Teacher, which my family laughs at hilariously because, you know, my son, my 15-year-old son says, "Mom, you got to change your name. You are not cool." But, you know, that's 15-year-old. The thing about it is, you know, I'm not one thing over another. You know, last time I checked, it's one nation under God. This whole charter school versus private school versus public school, it's time to look at us. We are U.S., that's us. It's time to improve all education. And the things I'm going to talk about is we are teachers, Flat Classroom Project, we are teachers from all types of schools, everywhere, and we are working together, not going through the bureaucracy, and joining our classrooms together. So, you know, we're struggling. We're all struggling with money, but I'll tell you, my school, we're a very small farming community. We're not what you would consider the elite private schools of a lot of up here in Atlanta. Our high school tuition is $4,200 a year. We are farmers. We don't have a lot of money. In fact, our funding is less than $100 per student for technology. So what I'm talking about is happening on a shoestring. So there's some opportunities and obstacles. I'm going to kind of take you through my classroom, and then I'm going to just kind of bring it home. As a blogger, I get emails from all over the place, especially from Georgia. So the stories I'm going to tell you are from Georgia public schools. The teachers that have emailed me that have told me why they can't do things like I'm doing in my classroom. So I want you to know what those obstacles are. But I love Dale Carnegie. He's one of my heroes. And he says there's two kinds of people, transmitters and transformers. Transformers turn the negativity into something positive. I was in New York not too long ago, and this amazing teacher, we were talking about her video conferencing program, and she said, I believe the budget cuts here in New York, which they've had some severe problems, are opportunistic because we're having to think outside the box. You know, I couldn't say this in India where I was back in February, but honestly, it's time to kill some sacred cows that just aren't producing milk anymore. They're not. We need to really look at what we're doing. It really hit home this morning about just cutting everything 2%. Cut everything. That makes absolutely no sense at all. So the other thing we have to really look at as it relates to technology is making decisions based upon fear, false evidence appearing real. You say technology, and what does everybody say? It's going to cost money. It's going to cost too much. We don't have money to do this. Why are we talking technology? We don't have enough money to pay the teachers. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest issues you have right now is that public school teachers in the state of Georgia are more down than they have ever been. Because I have friends who will tell you, I don't know how much money I'm going to make until I see it in the bank. Because these furlough days, the way they've been handled at the local level, you have angry teachers. So when you talk about transforming education, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of need, they need to have that safety and understand it. Now, there are a lot of opportunities. Look at California. They've done the open source textbook initiative. I know in Texas they're doing a lot with e-learning. Arkansas, they have a service learning program which does service learning and uses technology. But you know what they found? More kids are staying in school and math and science scores are going up because the kids say they have a purpose for coming to school. I have friends in Georgia Public Schools right now. Do you know how many times they've already done standardized testing? It's November, 4 times. When can they teach? They're testing all of the time. They've taken the one mandated test you give them, and they're doing it every month. So, one-to-one laptop programs, we have enough longitudinal studies. Project Red is what you need to look at. They've actually proven that learning goes up when you put laptops in the hands. There's proven ways to do this. We're not guessing anymore with this. Smartphone delivery and e-books. But it relates to the first thing, which is teacherpreneurship. Allowing teachers to customize their classroom to the learning and accept the risk for that. I should be held accountable for that. We've got to connect our students and not like Johnny here. The Flat Classroom Project was born in 2006. I get a lot of freedom from my school to innovate and create in my technology courses. Started as a program with 24 kids, 12 in my little tiny classroom at Westwood and Camilla, and 12 in Dhaka, Bangladesh with my good friend Julie Lindsay. We studied the 10 flatteners in Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat, but we said, you know what, we want the kids to experience this. Let's stop looking at books and let's start living what this is. This was in 2006. How many of you have heard of Wikipedia? We're teaching the students how to be professional editors of Wikipedia, how to be professional editors of things. So they edit wikis together. This is Casey. She just graduated last year. She graduated from high school having managed a global collaborative team to write wikis and create videos. And that's what she graduated having done. So they're creating videos. They're outsourcing part of their video to the students in the other parts of the world. We have other projects now studying digital citizenship. All of these projects, this is not done by a business, although we have a business now that does it. This is done by full-time teachers. I'm a full-time teacher. This is my hobby at night. We're teacher sourcing this. We're working together doing this. If you want to know the answer to some of these programs, yes, you can have public-private partnerships, but unleash your teachers. Allow them to customize the classroom and do this. So the students in our school are actually teaching other students how to be safe online. This is our kids teaching our 4th graders what kind of information can you share online using Woogie World, which is a really cool virtual world for younger kids. And then we have a big project in the spring we do with Don Tapscott. Thousands and thousands of kids, all different types of schools, but I'll tell you, the toughest 2 places to collaborate with on this planet are China and U.S. public schools. That is a fact, because everything is blocked in U.S. public schools. The competition that President Obama had about having the kids upload good education videos to YouTube, most schools couldn't do it because they couldn't access YouTube at school. So we're also using virtual worlds, which you'll hear Chris talk about more, to teach physics, X, Y, and Z coordinates. I teach programming in virtual worlds. The kids are already, they're in Club Penguin, they're in all these things already. They love it. This younger generation, 12 and under, they're a new generation. We're calling them Generation V, Generation Virtual. They're not the social media. They're the Club Penguin kids that are doing things virtually. So we've moved all of this online collaborative worldwide learning to all of our courses. It's grown since 2006 to a school-wide type thing. And these slides will be posted online so you can come back and look at that. The one thing that scares me about the 21st century skills movement, and Amy Carter and I had some good discussions about this. Yes, state legislatures need to talk about 21st century skills, but don't forget 21st century connections. You've got to start talking about all these different things. So teacherpreneurship lets you connect globally, understand culture without the cost of travel. My students who live in Camilla, Georgia, many of them only go to Panama City Beach. That's the farthest they're ever going to get from Camilla. They can tell you how to work with kids from India, the Middle East, China, Australia, Europe, everywhere, all over the world. First-hand experience without leaving Camilla. So there are a lot of obstacles, I will tell you. I have a special agreement with my school that gives me intellectual property rights to the things I create. Right now, if a teacher in a public school goes and creates something, the school owns it. Why are they going to innovate? The school's not going to use it. It's kind of like the bully who steals all the suckers. and he's not going to eat them. He just wants them for himself. The schools aren't going to use that intellectual property. Why not allow teachers to create things and allow them? A lot of teachers can't even write books about what they do because you know what? School owns the intellectual property. So if you want teachers to innovate, create ways that they can innovate. This over-standardization, lack of freedom, excessive filtration. Also, college prep students in the state of Georgia tend to not have access to technology because technology is considered vocational. It is not considered college prep. So many schools, I've had 5 transfer students this year, 3 from charter, 2 from public schools. They don't know how to open documents. They don't know how to save documents. They know how to use Google a little bit. That's it. And you know, it's about us. It's not about one or the other. We've all got to work together to make them, they should know more than you. Some of you feel, you know, technology illiterate. They should know more than you when they graduate from high school about this stuff. So digital citizenship, we need to teach kids to use their brain. Machines don't have a brain. If you hear the things on the news that are happening with people misusing social media, it's the brain that caused it, not the technology. Digital citizenship should be part of everything we do, just like driver's ed. We should be teaching that. There's safe ways to do what some consider dangerous. This is me in the Middle East. This is where this has taken me. You know, I never would have pictured being in the Middle East, but when you learn with people online, it opens up doors and amazing things that can happen. Here are just some scenes that these are my students at different conferences. The school travels with us virtually. When we went to India, we had the India Immersion Project. Every kid, grade 2 through 8, immersed in India. They Skyped with us daily. We took the laptops and the wireless around. We took them on tours of India. They had questions about the gateway of India. We went and asked somebody, recorded it, sent back to the 2nd grade class, and they learned the next day. Vicarious learning. We've got a conference coming up. My husband back in the corner has some cards about the Flat Classroom Conference that we run now, where we bring people together and talk about how to do this new model of learning. So, why is digital citizenship not being taught? Number one, no room in curriculum. A lot of people aren't willing to discuss these things because it's too controversial and these things are blocked. I want to show you Atif, and then I'm going to finish up here. Atif is in Bangladesh. To graduate from high school, he has to create a podcast, have a video, be able to create videos, and be able to create online websites. He has to be able to do that to graduate. What are we requiring here? We're requiring tests. What can they do? What can they create? Do they have higher order thinking? We need to redefine achievement. This is my student. My students create personal websites on what they're doing. The cell phone, we want them to have dictionaries. You know, I love these initiatives that give kids dictionaries. But honestly, teach them how to Google from their cell phone. It takes 10 seconds to look up a word. They always have their cell phone with them. We're banning cell phones everywhere. We should be using those. You can do translations, calculations, phone numbers, all kinds of things. We also don't have a lot of money. Do you know you have a digital recorder and a camera in that cell phone that you can do that's at no cost? You can use that for pictures. We film on cell phones all the time in my classroom, and we use them when they need them. So if we can't afford laptops, start harnessing the power in their pocket. There's studies showing improvement in math scores when you use smartphones for learning. So we use cell phones because we don't have a lot of money. E-books, why are we using paper? You know, my dad, he farms, James Lee Adams, he farms with trees. And yes, I love the fact that he can sell those pine trees every so often. But why are we printing textbooks that are outdated the moment they're printing? A lot of schools are using Nintendo DSs to teach math games. You talk about having excited kids teaching math on a DS. These are the kind of things that we should be looking at. We should be replacing these things. Last thing is, we know a lot of people are waiting on Superman. Well, what we need is Super Can. There are things that we can do. It's going to take all of us to say, you know what, we can't do this anymore, but we can do this. There are things we can do. We need to stop feeling sorry for ourselves. My grandmother went through the Great Depression, and they came out of it stronger and better, and goodness knows we can too, because that's what America is about. So we need slow, steady improvement. We need to improve our schools. And the one thing I'll challenge you is that we are better at coping than exerting influence, and I would encourage you and challenge you, it's time to exert influence to make these things happen. So this can happen in every school across the state of Georgia and then spread from Georgia to the rest of our country. Thanks.
I think we've been schooled. It's interesting when you're speaking, Vicki, I couldn't help but think that you know, the critical skill set in today's society is collaboration. Like, there isn't any of us that can do their job, even for an 8-hour day or a 10-hour day, without collaborating. It seems to be, you can't get anything done without collaboration, and yet in our traditional schools, collaboration equals cheating. That you sit in your desk and you do your work, and unless it's an assigned group project, we work on our own. And it's just another example of how our current model of education is completely out of touch with the reality that Vicki just demonstrated. And we have to fundamentally change that if we're gonna move forward. So, Chris, tell us a little bit about what's happening in the business world, and specifically the things that you're working on, and how current technology, as you see it, both in the virtual world, could have some powerful impacts in terms of what could happen in the classroom.
Sure. At a high level, I'll talk about kind of what's happening with the digital world in terms of video games and social games out there. There's it's one of the areas that we've been focusing on is making a world where people can go in there and experience kind of their own world, and that they can go to clubs, they can go to all over imaginary worlds, I guess. And within that, though, people are meeting, dancing, and one of the things that's been kind of interesting is socially, people are starting to get married in the virtual world and so on. But within that, though, one of the things that's pretty exciting is from a business model perspective, there's been a transformation in the video game business to what they call microtransactions. And so instead of selling expensive games up front, more and more games are switching to a free-to-play model. So you're going to see content become even cheaper down to free. And then what a lot of these games are doing is they're upgrading. They give you the ability to upgrade for $1 or $2 the in-game experience. And so several games have really taken off that way. Farmville. Anybody here play Farmville? Nobody plays Farmville? Nobody's being honest? All right. There's a few. Some of your friends might be playing. If you're on Facebook, there's a few of you who've gotten sheep or a plant. But anyways, there's about 60 million people playing Farmville every month. And within that, though, it's free to play. But then when you want to upgrade, you know, we're talking about farmers. If you want to upgrade your virtual plants, you know, it might be $1, might be $10. I've had some friends said he bought some special rings so the plants wouldn't die, and spent like $50 on that one. So some people will spend a lot of money on keeping their virtual farm healthy. And within that, the projected revenue, I think last year was over $1 billion in virtual goods. And I think actually Microsoft said on the Xbox alone, just on the virtual goods, not the actual video games, but buying these Xbox points, et cetera, they generated over $1 billion. And they're saying over the next 3 to 4 years, in terms of entertainment value, the revenue associated with virtual goods will be bigger than movies and music combined. So it's going to be bigger than what we perceive as entertainment today. Within that, though, and in fact, I think this week a game came out called Call of Duty. It's kind of a run around, shoot each other. That just generated, I think, $360 million, which is more than any movie's ever done on an opening day. Within that, at a high level, though, I think some of the trends that I'm seeing with all these video games and why it's going to be so big, there's this concept, you know, why do kids play the games? And ultimately, if you look at what's making these games exciting, is there's a constant reward mechanism. You're constantly getting trophies, you're getting badges, you're unlocking special features, you're getting points consistently, so it's showing you progression. You level up as you get so many points. We call this kind of the metagame, right? Or at a high level, it's this constant reward system. And so one of the things that's happening at a macro level that I think could be applied not only to video games, but to business and business simulators and business applications, as well as education, will be the gamification of a lot of this content. You know, if you look at most classes, there's not a lot of constant rewards. Versus this is, you know, if you watch kids play games, they're constantly getting more points, they're constantly getting rewarded. And so we're actually starting to see more and more of the innovative websites that are being built have progress, leveling, all these mechanisms that the things that make games very engaging, retentive, and viral is being applied now to more and more applications. And I think long term, I think we're going to see the courseware of trying to solve problems and learn physics and learn math, et cetera, needs to get gamified so that it's constantly fun. And I'll end with, like I was talking to my son, he's on the DS, Nintendo DS, he plays the computer, he's learning, I showed him a program, there's several different applications out there, and like, you show them just a little bit on how to program, and they start learning how to program and expressing themselves. But he was like, how come the classroom, he's actually really bored in his class, he's like, how come, my class isn't more like a video game? That would actually be a lot of fun. And I was like, you know what, you're right. Why isn't the courses and the content created to be more fun and more rewarding? And I think that's the challenge we face, is I think we have an opportunity that this concept of gamification and educational content needs to be more fun, especially when you're competing with Nintendo DS and movies and all this content that's out there that kids are exposed to. They're fed a lot of content. How do we make educational content more fun?
Chris's point about leveling is really important, because every game allows anybody to play at any level. And when you finish the game, it asks, do you want to start back at the level you just ended at? And it tracks your score and your high score. And so the part of the motivation is it's always rewarding, or it's always affirming incremental progress. Our schools, though, are set up exactly the opposite. We punish bad performance. You got a failing grade. We compare that to the rest of the class. There's little incentive for you to go back and start at that failing grade and try to move up. And so some of the principles that Chris was talking about, I think, are some of the analogies that can have in the classroom. Let's do one more question, and and then I want to open it up to Q&A. Let's talk about the future. So you've got a good understanding from kind of an international and national perspective, from a classroom perspective, and even from a business perspective, commerce perspective. Let's look at the future. Vicki, what does the future look like in this space? What would you want to see your fellow educators do in terms of embracing digital learning?
Well, it needs to become part of every course. Computers and laptops should pretty much be used everywhere. There was a friend of mine that was participating in a laptop study. They had one school that had put in laptops. They'd seen gains in everything but math. And they went into the school to check and see why. And the math teacher had posted on the door, no laptops allowed in this classroom. And you can use these things to improve learning. But the other thing I would like to see, to be competitive, the high-speed internet is the greatest thing ever invented for rural Georgia in particular. I live in rural Georgia. My sister is down the street. She has a graphic design business. One of her major customers, let's say their most famous mascot is a mouse with ears, that we all travel to see. And she lives in Camilla, Georgia, and does that over high-speed internet. It is so important for our kids to know how to collaborate on a global basis. I think, as a Georgian, that for a kid to graduate from a school in Georgia, they should have collaborated on a global basis before they get out of high school, period.
Chris, what kind of investments would you like to see businesses make in this technology? And what would you like to see schools potentially do in terms of using this technology?
Good question. I think there's a huge need for a kind of a business model where I kind of look at what's happening probably in the entertainment space. If you look at like YouTube, the reason YouTube's so powerful is that anybody can upload their video, share it, and it's become this great community of people creating exciting videos. And I wonder if there's not an opportunity to create something similar to YouTube, but more specifically to education, sharing educational classroom content. And the thing that made YouTube powerful isn't that you just uploaded videos, but there's a whole filtration system or a reward system that the more views you got, the higher the video ranked up. And at the end of the day, you end up with the very best videos every day being visible on YouTube. And the question I have is there a way to share the best educational content and have it ranked to the very top? And then ultimately, not just video content, but interactive content. The stuff that make video games engaging and rewarding. You know, if you take a class on physics, it needs to be interactive. You know, you learn best, I think a lot of people learn best by actually doing this stuff. So how do you make this content more interactive? And ultimately, how do you make it global? Because I think we're in a global world, meaning how do we get the best teachers, the best content from all over the world? The nice thing is the internet enables that. And I also think there's about to be a paradigm shift. Someone's going to make this, I believe, over the next 3 to 4 years. And it is from a cost structure, you know, to go to college nowadays, you know, it's over $100,000. If you go to a private college, some of them are over $200,000. That's going to be out of the ability, or out of reach of most Americans. And I think ultimately, if we shift to a much more distributed model, I think the cost of going to college should be like less than $1, but the awareness of how to do it. Georgia's starting to ramp up. There's things in Atlanta called Startup Lounge and others, and I just think long-term, I would think that's an important part of the curriculum, along with computing in general. One of the things, I'm very involved with Georgia Tech, and I was shocked when they were saying they've got to assume most students going to Georgia Tech have no computer skills. Because when you think about STEM, science, technology, and math, there's no C for computing. So they have to assume they've never touched a computer. And a lot of these kids, as Vicki pointed out, haven't, I guess, touched a computer, which is pretty hard to believe when you consider how important computing is for the future of our businesses. Every industry is being transformed by computing. So I think computing, entrepreneurship, and a system to share the best content in the world for education is something we need.
Susan, we've got a number of legislators in the room, both new and returning. We have a new governor. We're a race to the top winner. We have some leading edge higher ed institutions like Georgia Tech, as Chris mentioned, and Emory. What would you say, what policies do we need to implement here in Georgia to really accelerate our 21st century learning?
So I mentioned the shift from seat time, but it's more than what some states are doing in terms of giving seat time waivers. It really gets to the heart, actually, of both what Chris and Vicki were talking about, which is the idea that we take kids, let's say we have an 8th grader. We all know that in our urban schools, our rural schools, our suburban schools, in 8th grade, we've got kids coming in who are reading at an 8th grade reading level and doing math at, let's say, a 7th grade level. We've got kids coming into the 8th grade. Some of them are doing math at a 6th grade level and reading at a 4th grade level. Others are coming in maybe with reading skills at a 10th grade level and math skills at a 9th. But because we focus and shift everybody just based on age sorting and grade sorting, they come in, and whether that kid got a 70% or a C in math and science, it's back to this thing. They get put into the 8th grade and they keep moving. And by the time they get into high school, this high school dropout problem starts to happen in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, even before. If they're coming in to 9th grade, as many of our urban students are, at a 3rd or a 4th grade reading level, guess what? They can't read the textbooks anymore for biology or for their other subjects. So this idea of getting rid of seat time, that's just what we call it. We actually released a report, national report, this Wednesday, and the title is Failure is Not an Option, Designing Competency-Based Pathways for Next Generation Learning. And the idea behind it is very similar to what you're calling game models, but it's learning progressions and it's leveling. So if a kid is at a 4th grade reading level, they're not going to keep moving until they can demonstrate proficiency. And that is the difference between a performance-based assessment, where a teacher knows what that learning objective looks like and will not allow you to fill that box in the data system until you demonstrate proficiency. And that way, you've got a learning map and an individual learning plan for every kid. This is not rocket science. This is like mapping out what a kid knows and not letting them get to the 8th grade with these huge gaps in their education system, because that's where it gets really expensive. We start remediating, we don't even know where these gaps are. The problem is, like our system, when we developed these bubble tests in 1952, because they could, answer 3 questions at a time instead of hand scoring, seemed like a good idea. But now we've got other countries that are only doing performance-based models. So if you did the kind of work that Vicki's doing, and you have all these digital content options that have embedded assessments so you can model what is happening along the learning progression and ask your students to do a project, and that project has a way of being captured. This is more than a digital gradebook. The digital gradebook is just reinforcing the old seat time model. This is about taking a look at performance-based learning and moving away from that. And when you do that, then all of a sudden you can start putting the right incentives in place. Because seat time funding is an incentive to have the kids sit there in the seat no matter how well they do and move them on regardless of where they are in their pathway. When you look at performance-based models, and this has connotations now because of all of the teacher discussion, I actually believe you can't get to performance-based models for teachers until you have this system in place to begin with, because then you're judging people based on an old model. I hope that makes sense. This is a very complicated issue. This report is about 30 pages. It's free on our website, but it gets into how do schools look more like video games. It's not the video game entertainment component. It's the learning progressions in a very rational way and the levels, so you can see where those kids are. And actually, when there are levels like this, they're doing this in Adams 50 in Colorado. They've done this in Alaska. They had a district that had 1 kid in the last 20 years graduate and make it all the way through college. 1 kid in 20 years. When they switched to this, within 3 years, they had 80% of their kids graduating and going into colleges, because all of a sudden they could face the reality that was there in their system, which gets completely hidden when you fund based on seat time.
It's important to make sure you keep it a visual of the forest from the trees, and it's this: technology is not replacing the teacher, it's the medium by which teaching is transformed. I think you saw that in kind of Vicki's presentation most clearly, but a lot of times the opponents to online learning posture a position where we don't want our kids to be robots sitting in front of computers, and there's still value to physical teaching and learning. And the real issue here is digital learning can often be seen as, or perceived as, a threat to teachers and teacher unions. And the reality is, what we're doing is we're basically saying the traditional job of a teacher is impossible. Meaning, to keep track of 25 kids, 25 different learning styles, 25 different capacities and motivations without technology is impossible. Most teachers, decent teachers, know who their struggling students are in the classroom. Their problem is they can't actually stop the class and spend time with them, because what does the rest of the class do while they're doing that? And so when we think about this, I think most importantly in terms of, if it's going to be mainstream and if it's going to hit all of the state of Georgia, we have to think of it either in blended or hybrid environments, where there's a virtual teacher and there's a physical teacher, where technology is disaggregating down to the classroom. It's one of the things I've spent this year on, is designing a hybrid model. I'm hoping that hybrid schools will kind of be like hybrid cars. Eventually we'll drop the name hybrid out of it, because it's just the way schools will be designed and the way schools will run. So let me open it up for Q&A. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to ask Vicki or Susan this question about Georgia performance standards. The Georgia performance standards are is the curriculum, the new curriculum, relatively new, several years, for Georgia. How does that new curriculum help or hurt the kinds of innovations that you were talking about? And even to Chris, how does that allow this whole notion of entrepreneurship and gamification of education? How does the curriculum help or hurt that, and the lock-in that we've got to the Georgia performance standards?
Just real quick, I'll start. And the Georgia Performance Standards are now the Common Core across the country in math and English language arts, which are internationally benchmarked. The model I'm describing is a standards-based model. And what that does is, those are the learning targets. When you go in and you move from seat time to a performance-based model, you're still following those standards. But those standards should be clear, deep, well understood by the teachers, so when the student's demonstrating that, And it allows you to do these progressions or leveling up. There could be 10 different ways to demonstrate you understand that particular standard, but it requires a standards-based system to do that. Now, Vicki and Chris, I don't know if you agree with me on that or do kind of what we think of as standards plus, right? Standards plus entrepreneurship, standards plus knowing how to use all of these tools and have the technology skills with it.
I just have one example I'd like to share. I was in South Africa 2 weeks ago at the Microsoft Innovative Teachers Conference talking to teachers around the world, and I was actually there as media because now blogs, I guess, are considered media even though I'm just a teacher. But I was talking to one of the best schools in Colombia, the country of Colombia, and they're able to literally turn a school around in 1 year. They no longer have teachers, which this scares a lot of people, but I would really consider myself more of a coach. I feel like I have to apologize when people walk in my classroom because my classroom is very chaotic. It looks chaotic, but there's a lot of learning going on. But what they do is every kid has a laptop in these transformational schools, and they'll have 50 or 60 kids in a room. They have analysts who help them figure out where their track is, where are you on track, and then they have tutors. So if they're having trouble with physics, they still go to that content expert for help in physics. It's a totally different model, and I'll tell you that there are a lot of critics to it. I don't think the kinks have really been worked out. But you know, the question I guess I have is, in the state of Georgia, are we able to experiment? Are we able to do things like this? Because right now there's such a lot of schools are in straitjackets for many reasons. And we've got to look at allowing the innovation to happen. I get emails. I can't tell you how many emails I get from Georgia educators who say, Vicki, I would love to do flat classroom, but I just can't because of tests and standards. Or everything is blocked. I can't do this because they won't let us get on the Ning. They won't let us use a wiki at our school because we're a walled garden. So we've got to get rid of those straitjackets to allow this innovation to happen. There are some very simple things that would not cost the state a dime that could be done to allow and foster and promote not just entrepreneurship, which is hugely important. That's actually part of what we do in my own courses, but to allow teacherpreneurship, innovation. Yes, hold the teachers accountable. But you know, a lot of teachers are leaving teaching because there's this on the same page. If somebody handed me a script and told me I had to be on the same page as the teacher next door, I would completely quit. I am a professional. I know what I'm doing, I'll be held accountable, but don't make me be on the same page as 10 other teachers because that doesn't let me customize my classroom to what I need to do for my students. So, you know, we just need to pull the straitjacket off and allow innovation to happen, and that doesn't cost any money. We need bottom-up and top-down improvement. A lot of times, you know, for a country that has really believes in this entrepreneurship, we really are so centralized in so many things we do. And we need to start pushing that innovation down and allowing schools and teachers to innovate and removing those straitjackets.
It's a question from the audience. I think some of you got cards if you need it. It's a hypothetical question. I'll pose it to Chris. And it's, if all of the K-12 dollars that we spend in this state were in play, what would the R&D and product development response be of the business community in terms of virtual reality and simulating, you know, what kinds of R&D and product development would you see if the K-12 education budget was truly open to the private sector?
It's a good question. I don't, how much is that budget? 10 billion?
10 billion.
Okay. You know what, I'd probably, in terms of coming up with innovation, one of the exciting paradigm shifts that also are happening at a national level or international level is a concept of creating challenges, and this is opening up all kinds of opportunity out there. I think like DARPA used it as a challenge to universities to try and create a car that drives itself through the desert. I don't know if you guys, anybody see that? Anybody heard of the X Prize? Yeah. Okay, quite a few haven't heard of the X Prize. Basically, the X Prize was like a pretty interesting challenge. It was, can you get a private industry to fly a craft into, I guess, outer space or just outside of the Earth's atmosphere? And the gentleman who did it, I think, put in like $1 million, and then it got He put some insurance on it. It was like $10 million. It was a $10 million challenge, so we're not much smaller in terms of budget. And that challenge generated, all these research teams to go out and try to create this craft. And probably over $1 billion of research was put in because of this challenge. And you just see the impact of this. So there's been some other companies doing this. Netflix had their Netflix challenge, and it was like, if you could improve our algorithm for recommending movies. Anybody here use Netflix? Everybody? Okay, good. So the whole recommendation of movies, they had a challenge out there for $100,000, which maybe, I don't know if it sounds like a lot of money, but when you compare it to what it costs to hire an engineer, it's about one engineer equivalent, right? And so, but for $100,000, they actually had probably 50 to 100 engineers and all types of people working on this problem. And, from a risk perspective, there was no risk. It was just a matter of, if they solved 10% improvement, here's $100,000. So Netflix didn't have to pay someone full-time to work on this problem. They just put it out there as a challenge and had a huge impact there with all these people researching that problem. And I kind of liken it, could we use some of this budget money towards creating like the X Prize Educational Challenge? Come up with how do we create this innovative virtual educational classroom and put some challenges around it and have people around the world try to solve the problem.
And if you haven't seen this, the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates on October 11th this year, last month, announced Next Generation Learning Grand Challenges. We're one of the partners on that program. The first round, wave 1, is out right now for higher ed. I would encourage your higher ed institutions to be looking at that. And the wave 2 is coming next year, and it's going to be around K-12. And I think a lot of the conversations that we've been having up here sort of highlight the direction that this is going.
Unfortunately, we've got time for one last question, and so I'll pick it. And if you didn't get your question asked, come up and feel free to ask any of the panelists. And I think I'll give this one to Susan. Susan, are teachers' unions an impediment to virtual school? And if so, what can be done to offset this? And then there's a related question, which is, do you expect a decrease in the number of teachers, which I assume they're referring to if virtual schooling sort of takes off?
Yeah, great question. It's interesting because the teachers' union's very supportive of teachers teaching online in individual classes in schools where there's a union. So they're totally okay with online learning. Let's train every teacher in pre-service to have the skills to teach online so they can go teach hybrid or blended or online. And we actually worked with them. The NEA published a guide to quality online teaching. It's super supportive of online learning. If you start talking about virtual charter schools, then you run into the same lines that the unions have with all charter schools. So that's where the line is drawn in the sand. That's a tough line, I think, to hold up against. If you say kids can take 1 or 2 or 3 classes online, but if they're in a rural area and they're homebound or whatever, why shouldn't they have access to a full-time virtual charter school? So that's interesting. We're not seeing, people have this idea that in virtual schools you can have all these kids enrolled in your classes, right? We're seeing that the teacher-to-student ratios maybe are not the same as what we think of in a traditional classroom. In Virginia, virtual Virginia is 1 to 15 students in their online classes. We see other programs where it can be like 1 to 45 or even 1 to 50. When you have a really great teacher, they're going to be interacting with the students a lot, so you can't go to too high of a number with that ratio. The online teachers will tell you they interact more with their students than they even do in the face-to-face classrooms when it's a high-quality environment. So that's a real issue, and that's a real cost driver, too, that you don't see those teacher-to-student ratios go up. In the grand scheme of things, I think what you're going to be looking at is a different distribution model. I don't think you're going to see fewer teachers. The big issue is one that Governor Wise pointed to. In the next 10 years in the U.S., we've got 3 million teachers across the country. We're expecting 1 to 1.5 million of them to retire. So we're going to have massive teacher shortages everywhere. So we're going to be looking at new distribution models, and this is probably one of the only solutions to lots and lots of places.
Please join me in thanking Vicki, Chris, and Susan for their time today.
Thank you, Sajan. What an incredible panel. And remember, 3 of these 4 individuals live here in Georgia, and they're going to be here to answer your questions afterwards. Susan, we'd love you to move to Georgia.
I'm in Virginia, I'm not that far. So.
Thank you so much. First of all, we'd love for you to fill out a comment card and turn them into the basket in the back. And also, if you want to continue to hear about education, stay in this room in Ballroom C. We're going to be talking about criminal justice. You've got about 10 minutes for a break. Again, thank you to our panelists, and we'll see you in a few minutes.